Hi, everyone. This is the narrated version of a PowerPoint that I went over with the group in class about the birth of suburbia. And I explained to you that historians use this term suburbia to differentiate from suburbs. We have newer suburbs around the country and here in the St. Louis area, but suburbs have been around a long time, and I mentioned how Webster Groves or Webster University is, Kirkwood, the next suburb over. These are both communities that were built along railroad lines that were being constructed, and they're both over 100 years old. For the most part, suburbia began after World War II. That's when this housing construction boom starts, and across the country, examples of suburbia are designed to fit more the lifestyle revolving around driving and the automobile, as opposed to some form of public transportation like railroads. And we're going to focus on really the first example of suburbia, opens in the late 40s and expands, and that's Levittown, outside New York City on Long Island. So let's dig in. So I mentioned to the class that in the post-war period, coming out of World War II, Americans were longing for a return to normality. And people were figuring out how they defined that. And in fact, advertisements like this one by General Electric started to appear before the war was even over. And this is an example of what I talked about with the class, that the American experience in World War II was unique compared to other countries. We escaped the physical damage and vast destruction that other nations experienced. So Americans really had a unique and very different set of expectations. For many Americans, what came to represent, symbolize normality were things like marriage, home ownership, starting a family. And you have to remember that this is a generation that had experienced practically 2 decades worth of economic and social disruption, starting with the Great Depression. It started in late 1929 and lasted for an entire decade through the entire 1930s. And then you have World War II, several years in the mid 40s. And so this generation was ready to return to what they considered a normal existence. And these things, as I mentioned, marriage, home ownership, family, having children, these came to be seen as representing that ideal. And a phenomenon that happens that encourages this is what historians have termed the baby boom, a record 58 million births over a 15-year period, 1945 to 1960. Some historians extend the baby boom beyond 1960. The data shows it was declining even by the late 50s, although the birth rate still stayed pretty high, but not like it had been in the years immediately after World War II, especially. So I like to keep it within the parameters of this 15-year period. And scenes like you see in this slide, with the hospital overwhelmed with the number of babies, they don't have sufficient space in the nursery, so they've got babies in bassinets lined up in the hallway, was very common around the country. And this was encouraged and endorsed by the government through a piece of legislation that I mentioned, and Eric Foner talks about too, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known simply as the GI Bill, that set aside millions of dollars for low-interest loans to veterans for the purpose of going to college, purchasing a home, or starting a business. And I mentioned these loans were discriminatory. They were administered by banks, not directly by the government. The government provided the funds to local banks who distributed them. Local banks during this era frequently practiced discriminatory lending. And so for many Black veterans, it proved extremely difficult to get these benefits, and for some, impossible. Eric Foner mentioned how the United States had experienced a severe housing shortage during World War II as people relocated around the country because of being in the military or moving because of jobs. And so there was a need coming out of the Second World War for approximately 15 million new homes. And the person who perceives this better than anyone else initially was a veteran himself named William Levitt, who had grown up in Brooklyn. His father had been in the construction business as a home builder. And so Levitt had exposure to that. And he served in a branch of the U.S. Navy called the Seabees that specialized in large-scale construction projects. And what he learned there, those techniques, he brought back home in the post-war period. And he's going to become, as I note here, one of the wealthiest people in America by implementing plans based on what he had learned through his Navy service in World War II. So Levitt understood, having grown up in Brooklyn himself, that there wasn't space in cities for all this new housing. And so in the New York area, he started looking out on Long Island. You see here on the slide a large island, the borough of Brooklyn, where Levitt grew up, is here on the eastern tip of Long Island, and then you get out here to these wealthy enclaves, still the Hamptons. So he's looking here in this area, and Levitt bought up thousands of acres of farmland, what had primarily been potato farms, knocks down the few trees that are there, and then plans this first community that he modestly names after himself. And I mentioned to the class that this was happening all over the country. Not Levitt's building techniques, but Levitt is going to set into motion similar growth in suburbs that had been sleepy communities before World War II. And I mentioned the example of Irving, Texas, this town of not even 1,000 people, and showing an example of their big construction project in 1936 as a high school gym. Well, by 1960, the population of Irving had reached 46,000. Today, I have listed here 242,000. It's really closer to about 250,000 now. It's one of the major suburbs in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and home to the Dallas Cowboys. So what Levitt does in Levittown, Long Island, is that he plans this whole community. His architects plan this out in detail in kind of a grid. They put the streets in place. They measure, and all of the homes are going to be the exact same distance from one another. He got an exemption from the state of New York that allowed him not to construct a basement. So these homes were just built on a concrete slab, which sped up the process too. And Levitt organized his workers into gangs, each one with a specific task. He refused to use union labor that kept costs down as well. And so you had one group just go down the row of streets and pour the concrete foundation. That's all they would do. Another group would come behind them and do the framing. Another group, the windows, the roof. And so this was almost like taking Henry Ford's assembly line techniques that he developed for the automobile back in the teens and early 20s and applying it to housing construction. And with these methods, Levitt was able to construct as many as 36 houses a day. The basic design he had initially, he would come up with some variations on this before Levittown was completed, but the initial design was what was known as a Cape Cod style home. And this is designed for a family of 4. You have a kitchen, a living room, 1 bathroom, and 2 bedrooms, and some storage space. And these homes initially sold for under $7,000. Veterans could purchase these with $100 down. Now, that sounds ridiculous to you all today, $7,000 was a lot different in this period when Levitt's building. Average salary in the late 40s would have been somewhere between probably $2,500 and $4,000 a year, depending on your occupation. But still, these were prices that many Americans could afford. So here's a quick shot of what I was talking about, the exterior of a home being constructed. You see in the picture to the right a washing machine, which was an exciting feature. Many Americans had never had a washing machine in a home. You have to remember, a lot of these people who purchased these first Levittown homes had never even owned a house. They'd either rented apartments or lived in furnished rooms of some sort. And eventually, the entirety of Levittown would number over 17,000 homes. It's huge, just on a scale like nothing that had been constructed before. And it's going to revolutionize how people thought about home construction all across the country. Levitt was a racist, and reflecting, as I say here, the widespread discriminatory practices of the time, he refused to sell homes to Black Americans. This was very common, happened all over the United States, including here in St. Louis. There were residents in the original Levittown that spoke out against this. There were arguments in neighborhood association meetings at the beginning, but it took litigation and several years before the first Black families moved into a Levitt home here or in the second Levitt development outside Philadelphia. This is an example of what systemic racism looks like, as I mentioned to the class, where Black Americans are literally blocked from purchasing homes in this expanding suburbia in the post-war period that was only available initially to white families. So developers all across the country took Levitt's techniques and applied them, sometimes with disastrous results. Like you see here, this is a suburbia in Southern California that just looks like my vision of hell. You've got these houses right on top of one another, no green space, no trees. This is an extreme example, but nevertheless an example of Levitt's input. Many examples of suburbia around the country expanded on the green space that Levitt provided in the initial Levittown, but sometimes you got things like this that truly awful. And the development of suburbia contributed to the growth of what we now know urban sprawl. I love this photograph by Ernest Haas, and this is jumping ahead to 1969, a view of a main street in downtown Albuquerque, New Mexico, but you can see what I'm talking about. And there are examples of this you can see in the St. Louis area today, with all this clutter that expands outward towards suburbia away from what had been the core downtown of even larger cities like Albuquerque, with all the signage. Great example of this in St. Louis is if you get a carload of friends and start driving west on Manchester Avenue and start in the Grove neighborhood there, right just west of Slough, and go all the way out to West County. And you get to places like De Pere. De Pere is an example of suburbia where you don't even have a downtown core. It's just subdivisions, strip centers, and restaurants, fast food stuff, exactly what you see here. You do that trip on Manchester, it'll take more than one person to tally up just the number of CVS's that you see, the number of McDonald's. But I'm not saying that Levitt's responsible for all of that, but it's part of our modern world that it's developed as one of the outgrowths of suburbia, an example of how influential suburbia was on post-war America.